In the half-lit hours before dawn, when the wind carried with it the faint murmur of ancient stories drifting across the vast and unsettled plains of the southern frontier, there existed a silence so complete that even the shadows seemed hesitant to move, as though aware that history itself was gathering its breath before releasing a storm that would echo for generations. And within that silence, the old trading post known as Adobe Walls stood as a solitary monument to human stubbornness, courage, and the fragile ambition to stake permanence in a land that resisted all such claims. The year was 1874, a time when the Great Plains stretched in every direction like an undulating ocean of grass and dust, where the horizon was not merely a line, but an invitation or a warning, depending upon who gazed at it. Beneath that wide and indifferent sky, two civilizations, each ancient in its own way, approached a collision that neither fully sought, yet neither could avoid, and the events leading to that collision had long roots. Tangled in treaties broken, buffalo herds vanishing, and the tightening fist of a nation determined to carve order upon a continent that had its own understanding of balance. Adobe Walls, named for the sun-baked bricks that formed its earliest incarnation, had once been the center of a fur-trading world that thrived on barter, rumor, and frontier necessity. But by the summer of this fateful year, it had become a hub for buffalo hunters, men hardened by weather and work, their reputations stitched together from tales of sharpshooting, survival, and the relentless pursuit of hides that fetched small fortunes in eastern markets. These hunters, often operating in loose companies, brought with them long-range rifles that seemed almost unnatural in their reach, weapons whose precision had altered the very ecology of the plains, leaving hillsides littered with bones where mighty herds had once thundered unbroken across hundreds of miles. To the native nations whose lives were braided inseparably with the buffalo, Comanche, Kiowa, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, the hunters represented not just economic devastation, but a spiritual assault, an unraveling of a world that had endured since time immemorial. Among the warriors who felt this wound most sharply was Quanah Parker, the young Comanche leader whose lineage carried the dual legacy of his mother, Cynthia Ann Parker, a kidnapped settler raised fully within Comanche life, and his father, Pata Nocona, a war chief of profound renown. Quanah, tall, composed, and already recognized for his strategic brilliance, had become a symbol of resistance, embodying the hope that the buffalo might yet be protected, that the old ways might survive another season, another year, another generation. For months leading up to the events at Adobe Walls, tension had simmered across the plains like distant heat lightning, unspoken yet impossible to ignore. Raids increased, hunting camps were watched, and stories traveled on horsebacks faster than the truth could be confirmed, whispering that the time was coming when warriors from several tribes would gather in numbers reminiscent of earlier eras, when unity was a weapon as sharp as any lance. Those who lived at or near Adobe Walls, men such as Billy Dixon, famed for his exceptional marksmanship, and Bat Masterson, whose name would one day adorn legends of lawmen and gamblers, sensed that something restless moved just beyond the horizon, though none could yet articulate the scale of what approached. And so, on the night of June 26, 1874, as the hunters retired to their bunks or settled around muted conversations, and as the prairie winds brushed softly against the wooden edges of the post, the world remained deceptively calm, unaware that within a few hours it would become the stage for one of the most extraordinary clashes of the American frontier, a battle defined not only by courage and violence, but by the haunting understanding that two worlds were meeting in a moment neither could escape. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that dawn would bring with it not simply light, but revelation, the sharp cry of warriors riding beneath a sky already warming with the first hints of daybreak, the explosive retort of rifles capable of striking targets farther than most men believed possible, and the beginning of a story that would, in time, grow into myth. The hunters slept fitfully, their minds occupied with the practicalities of the next day's work, maintaining rifles, tending to horses, planning the routes across the buffalo ranges. Few, if any, contemplated how intimately their fate had already interwoven with that of the warriors gathering miles away. Warriors who rode beneath a moon still low in the sky, their faces painted with the symbols of their clans, their hearts heavy with the urgency of protecting what remained of their world. Quanah Parker, though young, understood better than most the enormity of the task before them, and as he led his horse across the soft earth of the plains, he carried within him the knowledge that this battle, whatever its outcome, would become a hinge upon which history might turn, altering forever the balance between the old freedom of the Comanche and the encroaching certainty of the American frontier. Rumors had reached him that Adobe Walls housed not only hunters, but sharpshooters whose weapons could pierce the air across remarkable distances, men who regarded the buffalo as mere resources, rather than living beings intertwined with the pulse of the land. Yet Quanah was not driven by simple anger. His motivations lay deeper, reaching into the roots of ancestral memory, the understanding that the buffalo were gifts from the Creator, and that to see them slaughtered not for sustenance, but for commerce, was to witness a slow unraveling of identity itself. Behind him rode more than 700 warriors from allied tribes, a gathering so large and so unified that older men among them remarked they had not seen its equal in years. They rode in near silence, the only sounds the rhythm of hooves against grass and the occasional creak of saddle leather, each man carrying within him a mixture of resolve, hope, and a quiet recognition that before the next sunrise set, the world might indeed be changed. Adobe Walls, still dark and still sleeping, appeared unaware of its place in this unfolding drama. The hunters, though experienced in the dangers of frontier life, believed themselves relatively secure within the post's sturdy construction, its wooden walls reinforced after earlier skirmishes, its supply stores ample, its men armed with rifles whose barrels gleamed faintly even in low light. Among these rifles were the Sharps models, weapons revered for their long-range accuracy, tools that transformed the traditional distances of battle and introduced an element of asymmetry that many native warriors found both bewildering and infuriating. And yet, on this night, this final night of calm before the storm, even the Sharps rifles slept, leaning quietly against walls or resting in racks, unknowing of the pivotal role they would soon play. Outside, stars shimmered in the vast expanse above, their cold light falling upon the plains where both destiny and conflict rode steadily toward the same unassuming point. It was in these final moments before dawn that a strange sound rippled across the post, a dull crack, faint yet unmistakable. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a second sound followed, sharper, louder, as though something large had shifted within the earth itself. Men stirred, heads lifting from pillows, brows furrowed with confusion. A third sound came, a thunderous report that reverberated through the still air, jolting every sleeper awake. In the seconds that followed, reality arranged itself with brutal clarity. The ridgepole of one of the buildings had collapsed, its weight crashing down with enough force to mimic the distant opening volley of battle. But the collapse, though startling, served another purpose entirely. It woke the men of Adobe Walls moments before the warriors arrived. Had they still been sleeping when the first wave struck, the outcome might have been catastrophically different. Instead, awakened by accident or providence, depending upon one's view of such matters, the hunters now scrambled into hastily formed positions, grabbing rifles, loading ammunition, shouting warnings to one another as the first faint echoes of hoofbeats drifted toward the post from the east. Those hoofbeats grew louder by the second, building into a deep and resonant roar that seemed to rise from the very ground. And as the horizon brightened with the tender glow of incoming daylight, silhouettes emerged, riders upon riders upon riders, cresting the soft rise of the plains with the unified momentum of a single, enormous force. It was a sight so grand, so terrible, and so awe-inspiring that several men later recalled feeling something akin to reverence in those first few moments, as though witnessing not a battle, but a vision, a manifestation of the plains' ancient spirit. The warriors rode in tight formation at first, their painted horses gliding across the grass with the fluid grace of river currents, their voices rising in cries that blended grief, fury, and ceremonial purpose. Among them, Quanah Parker remained near the front, his presence steady, his gaze fixed upon Adobe Walls with the calm certainty of a man who understood not only his role in the coming conflict, but the symbolic weight of every decision he would make within it. The hunters, now fully alert, took positions along the barricades and rooftops, their movements practiced and efficient despite the adrenaline hammering through their veins. Billy Dixon, one of the most skilled marksmen among them, peered towards the incoming warriors with a mixture of respect and grim determination, fully aware that the rifles in their hands afforded them a range advantage that might mean the difference between survival and annihilation. Other men, such as Jim Hanrahan, the outspoken saloon owner, and Masterson, still early in the career that would one day reshape his legend, exchanged terse words as they prepared themselves for the opening shots. Time itself seemed to stretch in these early seconds, pulled taut by the tension between two converging forces, each rooted in traditions that defined the frontier's brutal and extraordinary drama. And then, as the first rays of sunlight spilled across the plains, banishing the last remnants of night, the battle began. And then, as the first rays of sunlight spilled across the plains, banishing the last remnants of night, the battle began in a surge of motion and sound so sudden that even the seasoned hunters felt their breath catch. For the warriors descended upon Adobe Walls with a velocity born from generations of defending homelands, their horses stretching forward in long, fluid strides, their lances and rifles lifted against the sky like extensions of the rising sun. The earth trembled beneath the weight of hundreds of hooves, dust lifting in swirling columns that caught the early light and turned the entire world into a shifting tapestry of gold, brown, and the deep crimson markings painted upon the faces of men who had come to restore balance to their land. Gunfire erupted from the walls of the post, each shot cracking through the morning air with a sharpness that felt almost unnatural in contrast to the ancient rhythm of the approaching charge. And the first impacts struck near the riders, splintering the earth around them, sending tufts of dirt rising in startled puffs. Some warriors veered aside, others pressed forward, undeterred by the terrifying accuracy of the Sharps rifles that now came fully alive in the hunters' hands. Inside Adobe Walls, chaos melded seamlessly with discipline. The men, though vastly outnumbered, understood that their survival depended upon not wasting a single moment, not hesitating in the face of a force so immense that earlier generations of settlers might have called it unstoppable. Dixon fired with calm precision, his eyes narrowing with every squeeze of the trigger, each shot landing closer to its mark as he compensated for distance, wind, and movement with the intuitive mastery of a man whose life had been shaped by the long and lonely horizons of the plains. Yet even as the hunters fought with a resolve sharpened by desperation, the warriors pressed their assault with courage that defied comprehension. They rode into the storm of bullets with the fierce certainty of men whose destinies were bound to the land beneath them, their voices rising in chants that carried the weight of prayers, the memory of ancestors, and the hope that future generations might still know a world in which the buffalo roamed free. Quanah Parker moved among them with extraordinary poise, guiding the charge, signaling shifts in formation, urging his men forward when opportunities arose, and pulling them back with the instinct of a commander who understood that bravery must always be tempered by strategy. As he rode, the wind tore through his hair, carrying with it the scent of sage and dust and smoke, and he felt the presence of his parents, of Peter Nakona's warrior teachings, of Cynthia Ann's dual heritage whispering across the boundaries of memory, strengthen his resolve. It was in these early minutes of battle that the full significance of the Sharps rifle became brutally apparent. Its range, far surpassing most weapons carried by the warriors, created lethal corridors of air where riders fell long before they reached the barricades. Horses stumbled, pierced with bullets invisible until the moment of impact. Bodies struck the earth with thuds that were swallowed instantly by the cacophony of gunfire and war cries. Still, the charge pressed onward. The warriors attempted to breach the post, wheeling toward vulnerable angles, rushing the walls with the hope that speed and surprise might carry them through before another wave of shots found their marks. At one point, a small group succeeded in reaching the very edge of the defenses, their horses leaping over piles of timber. But the hunters, fighting with desperate efficiency, repelled them with close-range fire. Smoke clung to the air now, drifting in slow currents that wrapped the buildings in an unsteady haze, making the world appear both dreamlike and horrifyingly vivid. The sounds overlapped until they were indistinguishable. Gunfire, hooves, shouts, the hiss of bullets slicing through air, the guttural cries of animals struck down mid-stride. And amid this chaos, the men within Adobe Walls felt a dawning realization. Despite being vastly outnumbered, their rifles were holding the warriors at bay, creating a fragile perimeter of survival that would have been impossible with lesser arms. Outside the post, the warriors regrouped, circling in broad arcs that mirrored the natural movement of buffalo herds, shifting in response to danger, each rider scanning for weaknesses, each awaiting Quanah's signal. The young leader weighed his choices with the gravity of a man who knew that every life in his command bore a lineage, a family, a history worth defending. He had not expected the hunters to awaken so quickly. The collapse of the ridgepole had altered the timing of the attack in ways he could not have foreseen. Still, he remained steadfast, his mind already adjusting tactics, his spirit anchored in the conviction that a single failed charge did not define the outcome of a battle. Back inside Adobe Walls, Hanrahan shouted orders with a mixture of authority and anxiety, directing men toward better positions, reminding them to conserve ammunition. The hunters understood that though they held superior range, they were few, and each shot carried the weight of necessity. Masterson, younger than many of the others, but already displaying the calm under fire that would shape his later legend, moved along the barricades with steady hands, lending support wherever the line seemed weakest. As the sun climbed higher, the heat grew, baking the plains in a shimmering veil that distorted distance and made every movement seem unreal. Shadows wavered like spirits rising from the earth, and the cries of the wounded mingled with the wind in ways that made the entire battlefield feel suspended between worlds, the living, the dead, and the stories yet to be told. A second charge came, this one more coordinated, the warriors spreading into a wide crescent that enveloped the post on three sides, attempting to overwhelm the defenders through sheer number and velocity. For a moment, it seemed as though the ground itself moved, alive with the pounding of hooves and the rhythmic rise and fall of weapons glinting in the unforgiving sun. The hunters braced, rifles barked, bullets tore through the air, tracing invisible arcs of fate that altered the course of moments, lives, and legacies. Warriors fell, others rode on, driven not by recklessness, but by a sacred duty to defend a way of life disappearing beneath the relentless press of westward expansion. To some hunters, watching the charge unfold was like witnessing an echo of an older America, one in which the plains were still ruled by the speed of horses and the spiritual power of tradition. To the warriors, the post represented a growing shadow, one that threatened not just buffalo herds, but the very balance between humankind and the natural world. As bodies fell upon the field, dust rising around them in soft, sorrowful clouds, the emotional weight of the conflict deepened. The hunters began to grasp that the warriors fought not for conquest, but for survival, for dignity, for the right to continue existing as they had for centuries. And yet, survival demanded that each man at Adobe Walls defend his own life with equal ferocity. The third charge came with a thunder that seemed to shake the very bones of the earth, and for a brief moment the defenders felt overwhelmed by the relentless determination of the warriors, who closed the distance with astonishing speed, weaving their horses in patterns designed to create confusion, to draw fire, to break the cohesion of the defenders' line. But the Sharps rifles, cold, unfeeling, engineered for lethality, continued to tilt the balance. One shot after another fell with mathematical precision, breaking momentum, disrupting formations, forcing the warriors into frustrated withdrawal. Still, the battle showed no signs of weakening. The warriors circled again. The hunters reloaded. Hooves churned the earth into a patchwork of torn grass and darkened soil. Smoke collected against the sky in slow spirals, like the lingering memory of prayers rising from a ritual fire. And it was in this charged, sorrowful, and increasingly desperate landscape that the moment which would later define the entire battle began to emerge. Not yet in its final form, but as a subtle stirring in Billy Dixon's mind, a recognition that the fight had entered a phase where range, precision, and the uncanny possibility of striking a target beyond ordinary sight might alter the psychological balance of both sides. But that moment, still forming at the edges of awareness, would not reveal its shape until later in the day, after the warriors had withdrawn to reassess, and the hunters had begun to understand that though they had survived the initial charges, the battle was far from over, and the weight of history now pressed upon them with a presence as heavy as the sun above. As the morning stretched toward noon, and the sun climbed higher, casting its stark, unforgiving light across the plains, the tempo of the battle shifted into a tense, uneasy rhythm that felt neither like victory nor defeat, but rather a prolonged suspension between the two, as though both sides stood within the pause of a great turning wheel, uncertain of where the next revolution might land them. The warriors had withdrawn to a distance beyond the immediate reach of the Sharps rifles, their horses moving like restless shadows across the golden grass, the men conferring in tight circles beneath the shimmering heat. They were not broken, nor were they discouraged. Instead, they recalibrated their understanding of the fight before them, murmuring strategies that blended ancestral traditions with the stark realities introduced by rifles capable of altering the very geometry of battle. Quanah Parker, poised and solemn, rode slowly among the groups of warriors, his posture carrying the paradoxical blend of youth and authority that had made him a figure of unifying presence. His face, painted with symbolic markings, remained calm as he listened to the elders and seasoned fighters, weighing their counsel against his own instincts. The warriors spoke of the post's unexpected preparedness, of the devastating reach of the hunters' rifles, and of the uncanny accuracy displayed by certain men along the barricades who seemed capable of striking targets at distances few had believed possible. And beneath their words lay another truth, unspoken but felt in the marrow of every man there. The buffalo were nearly gone, and this fight, this gathering of tribes in numbers not seen for years, represented both a desperate stand and a mourning ritual for a world that was slipping beyond recovery. One elder, his hair braided with strips of rawhide, and his eyes carrying the depth of many winters, placed a hand upon Quanah's arm and spoke softly of the need to adapt, of the wisdom in recognizing when bravery alone could not secure victory, and when survival required the preservation of warriors for battles yet to come. Quanah listened, nodding slowly, though his heart was heavy with the weight of command. He knew that withdrawing too soon might fracture the unity of purpose that had brought the tribes together, but he also understood that charging repeatedly into the long-range fire of the hunters would lead to unnecessary death, diminishing the strength of the people he had sworn to protect. Meanwhile, within the battered walls of Adobe Walls itself, the hunters moved with the subdued restlessness of men who knew that the silence between clashes was as dangerous as the clashes themselves, for it allowed thoughts to wander toward the possibilities that lay outside their control. Possibilities shaped by exhaustion, dwindling ammunition, and the sobering awareness that the warriors beyond the rise were numerous enough to resume their attack at any moment, overwhelming the post by sheer persistence, if not by force. Billy Dixon stood near one of the shattered barricades, gazing out at the distant figures of the regrouping warriors, the sun reflecting in hard glints off their lances and rifles. He felt the familiar calm settle over him, the quiet space within his mind where numbers, distances, and the arc of a bullet became simple, knowable elements. To others, shooting at extreme distances seemed mystical, uncanny. To Dixon, it was a discipline, a conversation between mathematics and instinct. Yet even he did not yet perceive how the hours ahead would shape his legacy, binding his name to an act that would be debated, mythologized, and recounted long after the last witnesses to this day had passed from the earth. The air inside the post shimmered with the mingling scents of gunpowder, dust, sweat, and the metallic tang of spent cartridges scattered across the ground. Hanrahan and Masterson conferred near the saloon door, their voices low, their expressions grim, yet resolute. Ammunition was still sufficient for the moment. Though not abundant, water remained manageable but precious, and the structural damage from the collapsing ridgepole had left certain areas of the post vulnerable to renewed assault. Still, morale held steadier than one might expect among men so vastly outnumbered, in part because the initial charges had been repelled so decisively, and in part because the hunters, hardened by years of frontier experience, understood that survival often belonged not to those with the greatest numbers, but to those with the greatest patience under pressure. A breeze drifted across the plains then, gentle at first, carrying with it the faint rustle of tall grass, bending beneath its touch, and with that breeze came the haunting quiet that only the frontier could summon. A quiet filled, not with peace, but with anticipation, as though the land itself sensed that the day's narrative had not yet reached its most pivotal chapter. Warriors in the distance mounted their horses once more, their movements organized but subdued. Quanah had resolved not to launch another full-force charge. Instead, he planned to test the hunters' positions with smaller, more agile strikes, probing for weaknesses. The strategy reflected both wisdom and sorrow, acknowledging the futility of meeting the Sharps rifles head-on, while still seeking a path toward reclaiming dignity in the face of technological imbalance. The hunters readied themselves again. Dixon checked his rifle, running his thumb along the edge of the breach with habitual precision. Others took positions near the corners of the post, watching the warriors spread into loose patterns that suggested preparation rather than retreat. And as the tension mounted once more, the sun reached its zenith, casting short, sharp shadows across the battlefield where bodies lay still, silent testimonies to courage, loss, and the tragic misalignment between two worlds whose collision had become inevitable long before this day dawned. When the next series of skirmishes began, they unfolded not as sweeping charges, but as rapid, unpredictable bursts of movement. Small bands of warriors darted forward, firing from horseback before wheeling away in wide arcs, their horses kicking up spirals of dust that drifted like ghosts settling over the field. Their shots, though courageous, lacked the range to reach the hunters with accuracy, while the return fire from the post, methodical, disciplined, devastating, often found its marks. One warrior, adorned with feathers and streaks of red and black paint across his arms, rode closer than most, his movements fluid and fearless. Dixon noted him through the sight, watched him lift his rifle, then watched him fall, sliding sideways off his mount as the horse continued its stride momentarily before veering away with a startled cry. Even the hunters, hardened as they were, felt the emotional weight of such moments. These were not soldiers of a foreign nation, nor criminals, nor opportunistic raiders. These were men who fought for something sacred, something the hunters themselves could not replace, should it disappear entirely. And yet, frontier life allowed no space for sentimentality in the heat of battle. Survival demanded detachment, and the rifles demanded precision. The warriors withdrew again, gathering near a distant rise where the land dipped slightly, creating a natural hollow that offered partial cover. From this vantage, they reassessed their losses, their voices rising and falling in a mixture of sorrow and determination. Some spoke of continuing the fight. Others counseled withdrawal, urging that they preserve their strength for battles fought under more favorable conditions. Quanah remained silent for a long while, his eyes fixed upon Adobe Walls, as though searching for an answer hidden within the weathered timber of the post itself. In that silence lay the unspoken recognition that this battle had become symbolic of something far larger than the immediate conflict. It was not merely a fight against buffalo hunters. It was a fight against the accelerating erasure of a world, and each man there felt the weight of participating in a moment that represented both the culmination of generations of resistance and the beginning of an irreversible transformation. Back inside the post, the hunters began to settle into a wary, watchful stillness. The initial adrenaline had faded, replaced by a bone-deep fatigue that made limbs feel heavy and breaths come slower. Some men fetched water, others gathered scattered ammunition. A few collapsed onto benches or against walls, wiping sweat from their brows with shaking hands. Yet no one fully relaxed. Their eyes remained fixed on the horizon wherever possible, scanning for movement, listening for the faint drum of approaching hooves that might signal another assault. It was in this uneasy lull that the event which would later burn itself into the annals of frontier legend began to take form. A moment born not of bravado or malice, but of calculation, observation, and the peculiar intersection of mathematics, instinct, and opportunity that define the rare skill of long-distance shooting. Several hunters had climbed to a vantage point from which the distant rise where the warriors gathered was partially visible. Through the wavering heat and drifting smoke, small clusters of mounted figures could be seen, their horses restless, their posture tense. One man muttered that the warriors appeared to be preparing for a final charge. Another insisted they were preparing to withdraw. Dixon, overhearing these speculations, stepped closer, raising his rifle with the practiced ease of a man handling an extension of his own body. He sighted down the barrel, narrowing his left eye as he focused upon a distant cluster of warriors who sat upon their mounts near the crest of the rise, so far away that to the naked eye they appeared no larger than flecks of dust drifting across the horizon. He did not intend to shoot at first, not because he doubted his ability, but because the distance seemed almost beyond the realm of practicality, even for a Sharp's rifle. Yet as he continued to watch, he noticed one figure among them who sat slightly apart, bearing himself with a quiet command that suggested leadership. Dixon could not know whether this man was Quanah or another distinguished warrior, but he recognized the significance of those who held the group together, those whose presence steadied others. And it was in that instant, with heat shimmering along the barrel and the sky vast and indifferent above, that Dixon made the decision, not out of malice, not out of triumph, but out of the cold, precise logic of a marksman who understood that shifting the balance of morale could end a battle that otherwise might drag into renewed bloodshed. He inhaled slowly, adjusted his aim, calculated the drop of the bullet over the immense distance, a distance that would later be measured at over 1,500 yards, a feat nearly unprecedented in the annals of frontier warfare. He exhaled. The rifle cracked, and the sound seemed to travel out across the plains with a resonance disproportionate to the single bullet it carried, as though the moment itself had decided to leave an imprint upon history. The distant warrior fell, those around him startled, then recoiled, their horses shifting with agitation. For a heartbeat, the entire battlefield froze, not because the shot had ended the fight, but because it had revealed something astonishing. The reach of the hunters extended farther than any man had believed possible. The hunters at Adobe Walls murmured among themselves in disbelief. Even Dixon, known for understatement and humility, felt a flicker of surprise at the extraordinary distance he had bridged. The warriors, though still numerous and capable, now faced a new reality. The very air above the plains had become a domain the hunters could command with deadly precision. And it was in this shared moment of revelation, heavy with awe and sorrow, and the sobering awareness of inevitability, that the trajectory of the battle shifted for the final time. For several breaths after the distant warrior collapsed beneath the impossible reach of Dixon's bullet, the world seemed suspended, as though the plains themselves had recoiled into silence. Even the wind, always a restless companion on those wide and lonely expanses, hesitated in its journey, leaving the grass frozen in mid-sway. The hunters inside Adobe Walls stared across the shimmering distance with expressions that mingled disbelief and solemn recognition. No cheers rose from their ranks. No triumphant shouts pierced the air. The moment was not one of exhilaration, but of revelation, a stark, humbling acknowledgement of the terrible reach of the technology they wielded and the irrevocable shift it represented in the balance between two worlds that had shared this land under vastly different terms. Among the warriors gathered upon the rise, a wave of shock rippled outward. Some dismounted instinctively, crouching beside their fallen comrade, while others looked toward the post with expressions that blended fury, sorrow, and a dawning awareness that the battlefield had changed shape beneath their feet. They had known the Sharps rifles were powerful. They had witnessed their devastation throughout the morning. But this shot, this silent messenger that had traveled farther than most men believed a bullet could maintain its breath, revealed a truth too stark to ignore. The enemy's range extended beyond the boundaries of traditional combat, beyond the strategies that had guided warriors for generations, beyond even the intuitive understanding of distance shaped by years upon the open prairie. Quanah Parker felt the weight of that truth settle upon him like a mantle woven from loss and foresight. He dismounted slowly, his gaze fixed upon the fallen warrior, whose name would never become as known as Dixon's, but whose death carried its own profound significance. Quanah knelt, pressing a hand lightly against the man's shoulder, murmuring words shaped by grief and the ceremonial dignity that had guided the Comanche long before the arrival of white settlers. Around him, the warriors waited, their horses shifting with restless uncertainty, ears flicking toward the distant post as though sensing that the next decision would determine not just the end of the battle, but the direction of history's next turning. He rose then, his expression composed but somber, and spoke quietly to the warriors nearest him. His voice carried not anger but acceptance, a measured understanding that bravery could not change the reach of the Sharp's rifle, nor could determination alone counter a weapon designed to strike with such cold and mathematical impartiality. For the sake of the people, for the preservation of the warriors who remained, for the continuity of a culture already under siege, the time had come to withdraw. Word traveled quickly among the allied tribes as Quanah's decision passed from rider to rider. And though many felt the sting of leaving the field without the decisive victory they had hoped for, their respect for Quanah's judgment outweighed any frustration. He had fought with wisdom, reading the battle with clarity. He had led with the courage required to guide hundreds into danger. And now he led with the courage required to preserve them. The warriors mounted their horses once more, not in the fierce formation of earlier charges, but in a controlled and solemn movement that conveyed both dignity and resignation. They rode in long arcs across the plains, their silhouettes gradually shrinking against the horizon as dust swirled around their retreating forms. To the hunters watching from Adobe Walls, the sight carried a complicated mixture of relief, sadness, and introspection. They had survived, yet no man among them felt untouched by what the day had revealed. Bat Masterson lowered his rifle slowly, his jaw set in contemplative tension as he watched the warriors fade into the shimmering distance. Hanrahan, usually brash and outspoken, stood unusually quiet, his eyes fixed upon the scene with a gravity that suggested he understood the battle's deeper implications. Several hunters exchanged glances in silence, their expressions reflecting the emotional heaviness of witnessing not just a military withdrawal, but the symbolic ebbing of an era. Within the post, the landscape bore the scars of the day's ferocity. Spent shells littered the ground in glinting piles. Walls were chipped and splintered from the impact of stray bullets. The collapsed ridgepole still lay in a heap of broken timber, an early omen that had unwittingly altered the course of survival. Bodies of horses and men lay upon the field, the solemn reminders of courage and desperation mingled together in the dust. The plains stretched endlessly beyond them, carrying the ghosts of centuries and the memory of all who had moved across them, whether for conquest or survival. Slowly, life within Adobe Walls resumed its fragile rhythm. Some men prepared defensive positions, fearing the warriors might return. Others tended to the wounded, though miraculously most had escaped serious injury due to the fortifications and the efficiency of their rifles. Dixon himself remained unassuming, stepping away from the vantage point as though the extraordinary shot he had fired were merely another in a long day's work. When questioned, he shrugged lightly, unwilling to assign grandeur to an act he viewed as a calculated decision rather than a feat destined for legend. And yet, even then, whispers began to stir among the hunters, whispers that would drift outward across the frontier like sparks borne on a restless wind, whispers that spoke of a shot so distant, so improbable, that it challenged the limits of what men believed possible. As afternoon softened into evening, the sun lowering towards the far edge of the world, casting long shadows across the battered earth, the emotional weight of the day settled more deeply upon the men. Their bodies ached, their nerves felt frayed, yet their survival brought with it a complicated quietude that made them contemplative. Some sat together near the remnants of the saloon, speaking in low tones about what they had witnessed. Others wandered the perimeter of the post, gazing out across the plains where the warriors had vanished, feeling the faint tremble of the earth still echoing in their bones. It was during these twilight hours, those strange liminal moments when the world shifts between light and darkness, that the full emotional complexity of the Battle of Adobe Walls emerged. For on this field, courage had existed on both sides, tragedy had existed on both sides, determination had existed on both sides, and in the center stood the sobering realization that modern weaponry had tipped the scales in ways that could never again be undone. Quanah Parker and his warriors rode through the deepening evening light, their silhouettes elongated across the grass like memories stretched thin between past and future. No songs rose from their ranks that night. No celebrations or war cries punctuated the quiet. Instead, an air of solemn reflection accompanied them, a collective understanding that they had fought not merely for victory, but for preservation, for the buffalo, for the right to maintain the connection between land, spirit, and identity. As night finally settled across the plains, covering the earth in a blanket of cool darkness pierced only by the faint glow of distant stars, both sides sat beneath the same sky, separated by miles, but united by the weight of a day that had altered their paths forever. The hunters gathered near fires within adobe walls, their faces illuminated by flickering flames as they recounted the battle in quiet tones, their words carrying a mixture of disbelief and reverence. They spoke of the warriors' courage, of the uncanny timing of the ridgepole collapse, of Dixon's impossible shot, and of the strange, humbling sense that the plains themselves had borne witness to something extraordinary. Dixon, typically sparse with words, simply stared into the fire, replaying in his mind the arc of that distant shot, wondering at the convergence of circumstance, instinct, and fate that had allowed him to strike a man nearly a mile away. Though others insisted upon its significance, he resisted embellishment. The moment, he felt, belonged more to the history of the plains than to his own name. Yet history would remember it differently. In years to come, the story of Adobe Walls would spread, first among buffalo hunters, then among settlers, then across newspapers that craved dramatic accounts of frontier life. Each retelling would stretch or compress the truth, shaping Dixon's shot into a symbol of technological superiority, of frontier legend building, of the widening divide between the old ways and the new. The warriors, camped miles away beneath the open sky, also spoke of the day's events, though their conversations were carried more by emotion than by narrative. Elders reflected upon the bravery shown by the younger men. Seasoned fighters spoke of the eerie precision of the hunters' rifles, and all whispered their grief for the fallen, whose spirits now joined those of the ancestors in lands beyond physical reach. Quanah Parker spoke little, though his silence carried meaning. He gazed at the horizon long after darkness fell, contemplating the path ahead, a path shaped by resistance, negotiation, and the enduring responsibility to protect his people during the most tumultuous era their world had ever faced. In his heart, he knew that Adobe Walls represented not the end, but a turning, a moment of clarity that demanded adaptation, resilience, and a deepened connection to the values that had always defined the Comanche. Strength, mobility, unity, and the wisdom to read the land as one reads the movements of the wind. The night deepened. Stars shimmered like ancestral fires in the vast darkness. Coyotes called to one another across the plains, their voices rising in mournful crescendos that echoed the day's sorrow. And somewhere between the hunters' campfires and the warriors' quiet encampment, the great, unbroken silence of the prairie returned, not to erase the events of the day, but to absorb them, to fold them into the endless memory carried by the land itself, where stories linger long after footprints fade. By the time dawn returned to the plains the following morning, stretching its pale light across a world still bearing the scars of battle, the significance of what had occurred at Adobe Walls had begun its quiet transformation from lived experience into legend, shaped not only by the men who survived it, but by the land that had witnessed it, holding its memory in the same vast silence that had long preserved the stories of those who lived and died upon its rugged canvas. The hunters stirred slowly, their bodies stiff from exhaustion, their eyes heavy with the weight of a night spent between uneasy sleep and anxious vigilance. They stepped outside to find the field unchanged, yet different, as though the first rays of light had etched into it the imprint of everything that had transpired. The broken earth where hooves had thundered, the still forms of horses lying motionless in the dust, the faint trails where warriors had ridden away beneath the cover of twilight. No further attack came. No distant hooves signaled a renewed charge. The horizon remained empty, save for the distant haze that always danced along the meeting point between earth and sky. And though relief stirred among the hunters, it came intertwined with a somber understanding that the warriors had not retreated out of weakness, but out of necessity, guided by a leader wise enough to preserve his people, rather than sacrifice them to a battle shaped by technology that no amount of bravery could overcome. Billy Dixon stepped outside the post's walls, breathing deeply of the cool morning air. He felt the familiar ache in his shoulders and arms, the residue of adrenaline now fading into a heavy calm. Men approached him, asking again about the incredible shot he had fired the day before, but Dixon shook his head, offering no more than he already had, that it had been a long shot, that he had aimed as best he could, that the wind and the rifle had carried the bullet farther than most might expect. In Dixon's mind, the shot had been less a feat of skill than a convergence of circumstances, an opportunity presented in a moment of tension, a choice made with the practical goal of ending further bloodshed. But even then, he sensed that others would not see it so plainly. To them, the shot represented something larger, something symbolic of the frontier itself, the strange, often brutal intersection between skill, fate, and the relentless march of technological advancement. As the hunters began the grim work of tending to the battlefield, hurrying the dead horses and gathering whatever remained of the warriors' presence, they moved with a reverence born from shared hardship. They were not men untouched by sentiment. They understood that each warrior who had fallen carried a lineage, a purpose, a story shaped by centuries of tradition. Some hunters paused beside those silent forms, offering quiet words of respect or simply bowing their heads, acknowledging in their own way the courage of those who had fought against impossible odds. The plains, so still now in the morning light, felt heavy with the intertwined spirits of all who had contested its vastness. The silence was neither peaceful nor oppressive. It was contemplative, as though the land itself pondered the shift it had witnessed, the sharpening divide between old ways and new, between the spiritual ties that bound native nations to the buffalo and the economic hunger that had driven hunters deep into territories once governed by seasonal rhythms rather than market demands. Quanah Parker and his warriors rode steadily away from Adobe Walls, mile after mile, passing beneath their horses' hooves as they traveled toward safer ground. The men remained quiet, their grief heavy yet carried with dignity, their respect for Quanah's leadership unshaken. From time to time, younger warriors looked back toward the horizon, as though struggling to reconcile their desire for victory with the wisdom of retreat. But the elders among them understood. Adobe Walls had revealed something irrefutable, that the world they had known, a world built upon mobility, the hunt, the spiritual kinship with the buffalo, was drawing nearer to its end. Not because the warriors lacked courage, nor because their leaders lacked strategy, but because technology had increasingly shaped the battlefield in ways that no amount of tradition could counterbalance. Quanah's jaw tightened as he rode, though his expression remained composed. He felt the sorrow of the day as deeply as any man among them. Yet beneath the sorrow lay the seed of determination, a determination not to surrender, but to adapt, to shepherd his people through the profound upheavals yet to come. In the years ahead, he would rise to become one of the most influential leaders of his time, guiding the Comanche through the painful transition into reservation life, advocating for their rights, and embodying the resilience that had defined them for generations. But on this day, as he rode away from Adobe Walls, he carried within him a private vow that he would never allow his people's spirit to be extinguished, even if the shape of their world changed beyond recognition. Back at the post, the hunters completed their work with somber efficiency. By afternoon, they gathered once more within the saloon, where the broken ridgepole still lay as a reminder of the strange twist of fate that had awakened them moments before the warriors' first charge. Had the collapse not occurred, many agreed, the outcome might have been devastatingly different. In this, some men saw providence, others saw coincidence, but all saw the narrow margin by which survival sometimes hung upon the frontier. As evening settled on the second day, the men at Adobe Walls sat around small fires, their faces warmed by the glow, their voices low as they recounted their experiences. They spoke of the warriors' courage with deep respect, acknowledging the determination that had brought more than 700 men to their doorstep. They spoke of Quanah Parker with admiration, even though few had seen him clearly in the chaos of battle. But stories of his leadership, reputation, and resolve traveled widely across the plains, reaching even those communities not directly connected to the tribes. They spoke, too, of Dixon's shot, though he himself remained reluctant to discuss it in anything more than practical terms. Others, however, recognized it as something that would ripple outward, shaping not only the narrative of Adobe Walls, but the mythic identity of the frontier itself, where extraordinary acts often grew into legendary tales that blurred the line between memory and myth. Yet even among the hunters, whose survival depended upon their rifles, a quiet unease drifted through their reflections. They understood in some instinctive way that Adobe Walls had not merely been a battle, but a foreshadowing, a glimpse into the broader transformation overtaking the West, where the tools of industry and expansion increasingly overshadowed the ancestral traditions of those who had lived upon the land long before the first trading post rose along its rivers. The plains, once dominated by the thunder of buffalo hooves, were falling silent. The hunters knew this, the warriors had felt it long before. And though the battle had ended, the tragedy that underlay it, the diminishing of a world held sacred by the native nations, continued its slow, inevitable course. When the hunters finally departed Adobe Walls in the weeks that followed, leaving the post to weather once more beneath the relentless sun and wind, they carried with them memories etched into the deepest chambers of their minds. Some returned east, drawn by the promise of telling their stories. Others remained upon the plains, continuing the hunt until the buffalo dwindled to near extinction. Dixon himself would carry the weight of his legendary shot for the rest of his life, though he never sought fame from it. In later years, he would speak of the battle as a somber testament to the changing frontier, a moment both remarkable and sorrowful. Quanah Parker, too, carried the memory of Adobe Walls into his leadership, allowing its lessons to shape his decisions as he navigated the turbulent decades that followed. For he understood that courage alone could not halt the tide of change, but dignity, unity, and adaptability might preserve the spirit of his people even as the world transformed around them. And so the Battle of Adobe Walls passed into history, a moment suspended between eras, where sharpshooters and native warriors clashed not merely over territory, but over the meaning of survival itself. It became a story told around campfires, printed in newspapers, whispered in trading posts, and later immortalized in books that sought to capture the ephemeral moment when the old frontier confronted the new. Yet beneath the layers of legend, beneath the numbers and names, beneath the retellings that stretched or compressed the truth, one quiet reality endured: that on a solitary stretch of plains beneath a vast and indifferent sky, two worlds met in a collision shaped by courage, sorrow, and the inexorable force of change. And the wind that swept across that battlefield, then, now, and always, carried with it the memories of all who had ridden, fought, lived, and died upon those lands, preserving their stories within the endless, whispering grass, where history lingers far longer than the footprints of any single generation. As the dust of Adobe Walls settles into memory, and the echoes of that distant rifle shot fade into the wide, unbroken silence of the plains, we are reminded that the American frontier was shaped not only by those who lived through it, but by those who keep its stories alive today. If this journey through history moved you, taught you something new, or stirred your imagination, let your voice join the conversation. Leave a comment and share your thoughts about the warriors, the hunters, and the world that changed forever on that lonely stretch of prairie. And if you'd like to explore more stories carved from courage, conflict, and the relentless spirit of the Old West, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these forgotten histories rise again from the shadows, carried forward like the wind over the plains, to all who still feel the pull of the frontier.